je vous propose d'écouter en priorité un échange que nous avons eu avec Kishore MAHBUBANI. Donc Kishore MAHBUBANI, je vous l'ai dit, c'est un diplomate singapourien qui a écrit un livre sur le jour où la Chine va gagner. Et ce qui est assez intéressant, c'est que ce livre a été préfacé par Hubert Védrine et qui, en français, s'appelle « Le jour où la Chine va gagner », mais en anglais, il y a un point d'interrogation. La Chine va-t-elle gagner? Comme quoi, en France, on se pose moins de questions qu'en anglais. Mais c'est un personnage très intéressant parce que non seulement il a été donc à l'ONU, mais il est très connaisseur de la Chine et il est d'origine indienne. Donc, vous voyez combien il peut être sensible aux différents rapports de force. Donc, je vous propose qu'on écoute cet échange que nous avons eu avec MAHBUBANI, auteur de ce livre très intéressant, « Le jour où la Chine va gagner, la fin de la suprématie américaine ». Nous écoutons cette interview, puis ensuite, nous donnerons la parole à Sylvie Berman. Merci de la vidéo.
Bonjour, cher Kishore MAHBUBANI. Je voudrais vous remercier très sincèrement de nous accorder ces moments de discussion à propos de votre réflexion sur les relations entre la Chine et les États-Unis. Vous avez écrit un livre très important qui s'appelle « Le jour où la Chine va gagner ». Ce livre a été publié en français avec une préface d'Hubert Védrine et il a été particulièrement bien reçu dans notre pays. Vous êtes un grand spécialiste des relations internationales. Vous avez une connaissance parfaite de la Chine. J'ai pu le mesurer puisque nous sommes membres ensemble de diverses structures pour la réflexion stratégique à propos de la Chine et j'ai pu apprécier la qualité de vos contacts avec les hautes autorités de Chine. Mais vous êtes aussi très bon connaisseur des États-Unis. Vous avez été diplomate, et notamment ambassadeur de Singapour aux Nations Unies, et vous avez même présidé le Conseil de sécurité. Donc, vous êtes sur ces sujets particulièrement bilingue. Et si on prend vos origines indiennes, vos responsabilités à Singapour, on voit que vous avez une vision à 360 degrés sur les questions qui sont aujourd'hui celles du monde tiraillé par cette tension entre la Chine et les États-Unis. Ma première réflexion est pour vous interroger et connaître votre pensée sur ce sujet, c'est pour constater que l'escalade des tensions entre la Chine et l'Amérique est puissante et au fond, elle apparaît très durable. Nous avons vécu tout récemment le voyage de Joe Biden en Europe où nous avons pu constater sa détermination à essayer de convaincre les Européens que les positions américaines contre la Chine étaient bonnes et qu'il fallait suivre les États-Unis en bons et loyaux alliés et presque en bons et loyaux alignés selon ses orientations. Et donc, nous sentons monter cette tension de manière inéluctable. Vous le décrivez dans votre livre. Donc, la première question qui m'interpelle, c'est au fond, est-ce que cette guerre est vraiment évitable? Est-ce que nous sommes dans un processus sur lequel l'intelligence, ou en tout cas le rationalisme, va pouvoir l'emporter? Et est-ce que cette bataille semble, au fond, une bataille à laquelle nous serions condamnés, la tension entre les États-Unis et la Chine qui pourrait mal tourner? Globalement, est-ce qu'il y a une place, cher Kishore, pour l'espoir?
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Pierre, for that wonderful, generous and warm introduction. Coming from you, it means a lot. I mean, you're a man of great global stature, and your generous words of praise mean a lot to me, and I appreciate them very much. But you've raised a very challenging question because the paradox about the US-China geopolitical contest, which I document in my book, Has China Won in English, is that the contest is both inevitable and avoidable. That's the paradox. And it's inevitable because it's driven by structural forces. So you mentioned, for example, President Joe Biden. And what's interesting is that, you know, in the paragraph 1 of my book, and my book was written in 2020, before President Biden, we knew President Biden was elected. And I said that the geopolitical contest was started by President Donald Trump, but it will continue after him. So in some ways, when Joe Biden continued the contest against China, he fulfilled the prediction I made in paragraph 1 of my book. So, and that alone illustrates that it is not driven by personalities. It doesn't matter whether it's Trump or it's Biden, it doesn't matter. It's driven by structural causes. And I point to 3 structural causes that are responsible for the escalation of this contest between US and China. The first one, of course, is the fact that this has been a rule of geopolitics for 2,000 years or so, that whenever the world's #1 emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's #1 power, the United States of America today, the world's #1 power always pushes down the world's #1 emerging power. And in fact, Graham Allison, a Harvard professor, has documented this in another book called Destined for War. And so that's one force. And the second force, of course, is a subconscious fear of what I call the yellow peril in the Western or American imagination. It's very hard to accept the fact that the next #1 power will be a non-Western power. Makes it even harder for the United States to accept it. And thirdly, the reason why there's a bipartisan consensus in the United States is that among many, even very thoughtful Americans, there was this assumption that when America engaged China, when America opened up China economically, then China would open up politically and become a democracy. And when China became a democracy, China and the US could live happily ever after. But as we know, China has not become a democracy and will not become a democracy anytime soon, because China has its own civilization, its own culture, its own tradition, and China will not become a replica of the West. And so, but that alone has caused massive bipartisan disappointment in the US, and therefore there's a bipartisan consensus that the US must stand up to China. But what is amazing is that even though it's driven by these structural forces, I still believe, #1, that there will be no war. I want to emphasize that, because if you have a nuclear war between two nuclear powers, US and China, you don't have a winner and a loser. You have a loser and a loser. I mean, US may lose 10 to 15 cities. China may lose 30 to 40 cities. Nobody wants to pay that price. So in a nuclear war will not happen. But something short of that, of course, could happen, and we should be very, very careful about it. But at the same time, I want to conclude by also saying that the contest is avoidable because we now live in a small, interdependent world, and the common global challenges are indeed as strong as our national challenges. So COVID-19 was one of them. It's demonstrated how all of humanity is now in the same boat. And climate change is also demonstrating that all 7.8 billion of us are on the same boat. And therefore, I hope that this arrival of these common challenges will make it possible to restrain the US-China geopolitical contest. So it cannot stop, but we can still try to restrain it. And I hope that Europe will play a restraining role in this contest. So I hope I've answered your question.
Merci beaucoup, Kishore. Oui, vous avez parfaitement répondu et donné au fond un espoir important, comme la dernière phrase de votre livre qui consiste à dire ce n'est peut-être qui va gagner, ce n'est peut-être pas les États-Unis. L'essentiel, c'est que l'humanité gagne et que chacun puisse développer une stratégie cohérente avec la défense de la planète. Alors aujourd'hui, dans toutes ces tensions, on voit en effet apparaître un consensus à propos de la planète, de la protection de notre espace vital. Et donc, au fond, la défense de l'humanité passe par la planète. Et de ce point de vue-là, le discours de Xi Jinping, quand il signe les accords de Paris, est assez voisin du discours de Biden quand il rejoint les accords de Paris. Est-ce que vous pensez qu'il pourrait y avoir dans l'avenir une forme de consensus sur ce qui pourrait être lié, disons, aux accords de Paris, à la protection de la planète et au changement climatique? Et cela viendrait un peu à dire que après le consensus de Washington, qui était un consensus fondé sur la performance économique, on pourrait envisager une perspective de consensus, un consensus de Paris, qui serait un consensus fondé sur la protection de l'humanité par la protection de la planète. Est-ce que ce n'est pas être trop optimiste ou trop utopiste de penser que la planétisation pourrait être une voie, si ce n'est de paix, en tout cas de coopération?
Well, you know, you asked a difficult question. Is it utopian? Are we expecting too much? And the big question is whether or not humanity at the end of the day does or does not represent the most intelligent species on planet Earth. And if indeed humanity, you know, unlike lions or tigers or elephants or monkeys, are supposed to have a better brain and can see the big picture and can understand the common interests of humanity, then clearly there should be a reason for some hope. Because I mean, in the most fundamental way, the world has changed. And to explain how the world has changed, I use a simple boat metaphor. In the past, when 7.8 billion people lived in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 193 separate boats, right? They were separated from each other. And of course, if one boat got COVID-19, the other boat wouldn't get it because in a different boat. But the world has shrunk and become a very small interdependent space. And today, the 7.8 billion people no longer live in 193 separate boats. The 7.8 billion people live on 193 separate cabins on the same boat. And that's why COVID-19 goes from one cabin to another cabin to another cabin. All cabins on the same boat. So logically, if you are on the same boat, and to extend the metaphor a bit, if one cabin catches fire, the stupidest thing is to argue about who started the fire. You first put out the fire on the boat, right? That's what you should do. But when COVID-19 broke out in China, Donald Trump said, no, you're to blame, you're to blame. There was no cooperation between US and China. And sadly, even to today, there isn't really serious cooperation between US and China to deal with COVID-19, but in fact, the whole world actually wants the US and China to cooperate to eliminate COVID-19 completely. And I hope, therefore, that humanity will begin to see that the world has changed fundamentally. And here, to be fair to President Joe Biden, I think if you ask President Joe Biden privately what he should be doing today, I think President Joe Biden would agree that he should collaborate with President Xi Jinping. And the good news, by the way, is that President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping get along very well personally, you know. But don't tell the world that, because Joe Biden doesn't want the world to know that. Because when President Xi Jinping was vice president, And when he visited the US, President Joe Biden spent a lot of time with him as his host. And when President Joe Biden visited China subsequently as vice president, even though President Xi Jinping was president, he hosted Joe Biden personally. And so they are actually get along very well with each other as two people. But Joe Biden cannot say that publicly, because if he says that, he'll be shot in America. And so that's part of the problem, that we still have domestic politics to deal with. And within the United States, as I mentioned earlier, there's such a strong consensus that the US must stand up to China that Joe Biden's hands are tied. So even though he wants to collaborate with President Xi Jinping on climate change, he wants to collaborate with President Xi Jinping to eliminate COVID-19, and also, frankly, he also knows that the trade war has not helped the United States at all. And let me give you one statistic just to illustrate how the trade war in the US has failed. In the year 2009, the size of the retail goods market in China was $1.8 trillion. And the size of the retail goods market in the United States was $4 trillion, more than double that of China. But by 2019, 10 years later, and 2019 is a significant year because this is 3 years after the trade war that Trump had launched on China. China's retail goods market went from $1.8 trillion to $6 trillion, and United States only went from $4 trillion to $5.5 trillion. So the United States retail goods market actually was smaller than that of China 3 years after the trade war. So it shows you that the trade war did not work at all. Privately, Joe Biden knows that. He knows that, but he cannot change it. And even though he's been in office now for 6-7 months, he cannot lift the tariffs and sanctions on China. So that's the tragedy that we face, that even though as intelligent species, we know that US and China should be cooperating with each other, but domestic political considerations get in the way. And that's why we must discuss this issue openly. And that's why the rest of the world, the remaining 6 billion, must send a common message to US and China. Please collaborate till our global challenges are over.
Merci, cher Kishore, pour ce message de coopération. Et on voit en effet que la leçon du Covid, c'est que les égoïsmes ont dominé la coopération. Finalement, au total, aujourd'hui, dans les relations internationales, la compétition l'emporte souvent sur la coopération. Néanmoins, cette coopération est essentielle et sans doute que derrière vos propos, il y a aussi une perspective pour l'Europe qui doit être une force d'équilibre dans cette tension quelque peu binaire. Bon, ma dernière question, cher professeur et cher ambassadeur, concerne directement la Chine, que vous connaissez mieux que quiconque. Au fond, la grande réussite de la Chine, ça a été quand même l'ouverture. Cette politique de Deng Xiaoping qui a connecté la Chine au monde, qui l'a fait se développer, franchir des caps technologiques. Et l'ouverture est une clé formidable du développement chinois depuis une trentaine d'années. Mais là, dans cette tension, il y a naturellement les graves divergences politiques entre les différents systèmes. Il y a donc des combats politiques, et il y a donc des agressivités qui se développent. Et tout cela entraîne, me semble-t-il, un esprit un peu de fermeture chez les uns et chez les autres. Et en Chine, on craint une sorte de fermeture, un abandon quelque peu stratégique de la politique d'ouverture. Et donc, on voit le pays avoir tendance à se fermer. Cette stratégie de développement de double circulation, en fait, est quand même une stratégie de développement interne puissant. On a un peu une crainte qu'avec cet affrontement, il y ait une logique de fermeture qui éloigne les uns et les autres de la compréhension des partenaires et qui finalement porte atteinte aux perspectives de coopération. Est-ce que vous craignez une fermeture de la Chine qui serait une fermeture économique, politique, mais aussi un peu dans l'esprit de la Chine qui se renfermerait sur l'empire du milieu et qui pourrait favoriser de nouvelles incompréhensions.
Well, Jean-Pierre, you're absolutely right that China has adopted a new strategy of dual circulation. And so China, because after the trade war started, realized that it could not rely on the United States, the world's largest economy, to become the driver of growth in China, because United States was imposing barriers. And so China very wisely decided that it would be driven by internal growth and external growth. But I want to emphasize that, that even though, the reason I'm glad I gave you the statistics on the retail goods market, it shows you how strong the internal growth has become a driver of China's growth. But China will never abandon external growth. And let me explain why. Because, the Chinese, the one thing that's the number one thing in Chinese minds, if you can step into the Chinese mind, the number one thing they're always thinking about is the century of humiliation from 1842 to 1949. And, they suffered from the Opium War, the settlements in Shanghai, the Sino-Japanese War, and they suffered a lot for over 100 years. And the Chinese have done some very deep reflection on why did China become so weak. And one of the answers that they have come to agree, and there's a very strong consensus on that now, is that China became weak because China closed the doors to the rest of the world. And China became strong when it opened the doors to the rest of the world. And you saw this in a speech that President Xi Jinping gave in Davos in January 2017. And I was in the room when he gave that speech, And he said that, when China dived into the ocean of globalization, China struggled to swim. He said, we drank water, we had difficulties. But after that, we succeeded. And when we succeeded, we became strong. And so the Chinese realized that if they close up their economy again, China will again become weak, like it was in the past, and must continue to remain an open economy. And today, among the major economies, what is interesting is that even though it was the United States that used to preach the value of free trade agreements, today, United States, the Congress will not approve free trade agreements with other countries. By contrast, China is ready to sign free trade agreements with almost anybody. And the largest free trade agreement has actually come into being this year in 2021, which is a regional comprehensive economic partnership, which has the 10 ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia, plus China, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, New Zealand. And these 15 countries, with the creation of the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, have now created the largest, what I call, economic ecosystem in the world. And it's an open ecosystem. And trade within this ecosystem is growing very fast, by the way. And just to give you one statistic, in the year 2000, the 10 countries of Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries, their trade with China was $40 billion, and their trade with the US was $130 billion. So ASEAN's trade with US was 3 times larger than ASEAN's trade with China in the year 2000. And of course, in the next year, 2001, ASEAN and China have signed a free trade agreement. And now US trade with ASEAN has gone up 3 times to $300 billion. But ASEAN's trade with China has gone up to $650 or $660 billion. So now ASEAN's trade with China is double ASEAN's trade with US, even though 20 years ago, US trade with ASEAN was 3 times that of China's. So you see how the world has changed fundamentally. And the Chinese realize that the reason why the last 40 years of Chinese history have been the best 40 years of history for the Chinese people in 4,000 years of Chinese history, because China has opened up its economy and integrated with the rest of the world. And so the people who are the greatest believers today in open globalization are no longer the leaders of the United States, it's the leaders of China. So I don't see China closing itself up anytime soon. And I see President Xi Jinping committed to keeping China open and integrated with the rest of the world.
Je voudrais vous remercier très profondément, cher Kishore, parce que dans votre propos, non seulement on sent la profondeur de l'analyse, mais on voit quand même une perspective positive de coopération, positive d'ouverture. C'est difficile, il y a des tensions, mais il y a aussi une possibilité de survie parce qu'il peut y avoir une possibilité de coopération. Non seulement vous donnez de l'espoir, mais je crois aussi que vous donnez à tous nos amis qui sont réunis dans ce grand forum que est au Futuroscope tous les ans, un grand rendez-vous de la pensée des relations internationales, vous donnez aussi une clé sur laquelle j'ai moi-même travaillé dans mon livre sur le paradoxe chinois. C'est cette idée de paradoxe, c'est cette idée au fond qu'il faut qu'on accepte, nous occidentaux, de vivre avec les contraires. Donc il peut y avoir une tension qui est à la fois inéluctable et évitable, vous dites dans votre livre. C'est-à-dire qu'il peut être à la fois yin et yang, qui peut être à la fois contradictoire. Et je pense que c'est une des clés très, très importantes que vous nous apportez, que vous développez dans vos ouvrages, qui est cette idée qu'il faut bien se dire que la Chine est capable de vivre avec ses contraires et qu'elle n'est pas, comme nous quelquefois en Occident, toujours à chercher la vérité unique, celle qui s'impose à tout le monde et qui doit s'imposer de manière universelle, ce qui est notre culture, mais qui n'est pas naturellement la culture de la grande civilisation chinoise. Donc chacun a ses défauts, chacun a ses convictions, chacun naturellement a intérêt à défendre ses propres logiques, mais nous voyons bien que au-delà des divergences politiques qui sont incontestables, il y a quand même une exigence de coopération et donc d'ouverture qui est naturellement liée à la protection de l'humanité, comme vous le dites. Et donc, je voudrais vous remercier beaucoup des clés que vous donnez à tous ceux qui s'intéressent à ces questions et qui finalement ont comme objectif en commun la paix. Merci beaucoup, Kishore. Je vous laisse le mot de la fin, si vous le voulez bien.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And I'm very glad, Jean-Pierre, that you mentioned the concept of yin and yang, you know, because it's very important to understand that in the 21st century, one of the big changes that is happening is that we are going from a world of one successful civilization, Western civilization, to a world of many successful civilizations. And many in the United States see this as a contradiction, that you can only have one successful civilization and not have two successful civilizations side by side. But the Chinese concept of yin and yang says that, you know, you can have United States and the West succeeding very well and doing very well within their own civilization. And Chinese civilization could also succeed and do very well within its own civilization. And the world is better off by having two or more successful civilizations rather than just one. And, you know, if you look at Chinese history for over 4,000 years or so, you know, whenever the Chinese dynastic cycle goes up, it goes up for like 200 years before it goes down again, maybe for another 100, 200 years. And right now, we've just had the first 40 years of a new sort of dynastic cycle of going up in Chinese history. So we have seen only the first 40 years. And for the next 100 to 150 years, China will keep on doing very well. And so we have to understand that and say, but that doesn't mean that's bad for the world. And as far as many of the neighbors of Southeast Asia are concerned, that China's growth gives us tremendous opportunities. And that's why I gave the statistics on trade between Southeast Asia and China. And by the way, incidentally, China's #1 trading partners used to be the US, used to be the European Union. Now China's #1 trading partner actually are the 10 countries of Southeast Asia. That's an example of how the world has changed. But we must try and understand this concept of yin and yang, and understand that as far as China is concerned, China is happy that the West is doing well. China is happy that China is doing well. And China believes that the two civilizations can coexist in peace. And that, I hope, is an optimistic message that we can convey to your friends in France.
Je voudrais remercier la Fondation Prospective Innovation pour la qualité de cette interview, même si je pense qu'à l'avenir, il faut qu'elle ait des intervieweurs un peu moins bavards.